Hey, everybody. We're going to get started. Thanks for joining us today. Just going to do a couple of quick housekeeping things, and then we're going to jump right in. So we are recording today's session. So if you want to come back and listen to some of the great points that I'm sure are going to come up, you'll be able to do that in a couple days, and of course, share it with your colleagues. And also make sure to check out all our previous episodes, and we've got a couple of great episodes that are coming up in the next few weeks as well. Also, if you have any questions, put them down below the video here. We're not going to get to them during this session because we want to spend as much time as possible directly with Michael, but we will do our best to answer them afterwards. So with that, Michael, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Lee. I always enjoy our conversations over the years, so I'm excited about this.
Excellent. So before we get to talking about the most important thing, the Yankees, just for our guests, I bet people are wondering how to pronounce your last name.
Sure. It's a French name. Guillet is the right. So if you think about guillotine as the front part, and then ballet or beignet as the end, those are kind of the two sounds come together.
I like the beignet part better than the part about chopping heads off, but that's...
Yeah, it gives you a little contrast of the span of my personality, right?
I like that. That's good. So actually, I want to jump into talking about the Yankees a little bit as the first question. I was kind of thinking about what I wanted to get to first. So we are both big Yankee fans, and for folks that follow the team, especially this year, although in previous years, they hit a lot of home runs. And this, I think if you took away their ability to hit home runs, they would really be losing probably most of their games, especially this year. Can really see it. So what do you think is the one skill that organizations need when it comes to analytics, that if they lose it, it would make a huge impact?
I think both individually and from an organizational standpoint, I think where folks get burned or they have a tendency to kind of be too optimistic is a heavy level of skepticism about their own data, be it the data quality, be it the kind of what they're sharing with their customers. I think a healthy amount of skepticism is the right thing to have. And the thing I kind of, for the folks on our team, both here at SalesLoft, those are the things when we look at something and someone raises a concern, a question, it's not a red flag for me. It's a good thing. Someone's raised something and said, hey, what about this? Or have we thought about that? Let me give you an example. A few years ago, we had in a prior life, we had a call with a customer. So my boss, the head of product, was on a call with the customer. The customer was raving about the analytics features and how much he loved it and how excited it was. My boss was like, this is great. Let's get this guy to do a testimonial. Let's get marketing involved. Let's do this. And I said, he's too happy. Something's not right. And literally at the end of the day, I went in and there's actually a Tableau server feature. We went in and looked at usage and we find out that he logged in once in only the past 45 days.
Huh.
So the whole idea about it, him loving the feature, the product, was difficult for him to articulate because he was just trying to be nice and to be helpful. But he was using the platform, but the analytics features he was not using.
So how do you? So I think it's interesting because what you're saying is, if you lose your if I just to rephrase it,
Sure.
If you lose your ability to be skeptical, that could be risky.
Exactly.
And so how do you?
Things are never as bad, right? Or never as good. It's probably another way to kind of think about that.
But people don't like to think about things on the negative side, right? They tend to shy away from that, whether it's for my own good, or I feel like, oh, they're going to blame me, or that you've missed something, and so there's going to be lots of finger pointing, kinds of stuff. So how do you get people comfortable with the idea that what you're suggesting is a good thing, right? Look, you want to be you want to be skeptical, maybe not to the extreme, right? There's probably limits, but how do you get people to be like, yeah, this is a smart thing to do?
I think examples. It's not too hard to find an example. I also think that let me give you kind of another example that we've done here at SalesLoft. Right, we'll produce new reports and new charts. Right, and one of the always things that our team has kind of grown a little bit kind of sensitive to is when someone says a particular chart is pretty,
Mm.
right, or good looking or attractive. Those are not the adjectives we want, and usually that feedback is coming internally, right?
Hmm.
So before we source it to a customer, we're looking for feedback about it's useful, it's helpful, I saved time, it taught me something, I learned something, I understand something I didn't. So we're looking for those kinds of adjectives, and it's not a matter of just being skeptic. I think is a broad kind of brush statement, but it's the idea about like what we're in tune to listening for. It's
Mm.
kind of another way to think about it. So we're looking for kind of a certain same thing would apply in data science, right? In our data science case, like the model comes back and says there's a high degree of causation. Like, okay, are we sure the data's right? Right? What did we make any mistakes? Is there anything funky about the data? And it's just a matter of kind of it's almost like what our kids we tell our kids do. Did you check your work?
Right. But now I think in some ways people might argue that you shouldn't have to be skeptical, right? A lot of what goes on today you hear about with things like um, data governance and trusted, source of data, things of that nature, where people that are working with the data, right, like you're describing, should feel highly confident that the data itself is correct and that I shouldn't have to spend time being skeptical of it, like you're suggesting. So, can you kind of talk about that a little bit?
Sure. I mean, so if you think, I remember in a previous life too, we were working with um, a large hotel chain that was looking to kind of share data with partners, right? And just by asking questions, we understood that there were 12 different definitions of revenue, right? There were revenue including online, there were revenue just from the call center, all these different kinds of revenue. So whenever we showed a revenue number being displayed, the logical question, the skeptical one was like, which revenue is this,
Which one?
right?
So
So
somehow that made it through the kind of back end aspect of it. And
yeah,
yeah,
and they had
interesting.
data governance. It was well defined, but it was a simple kind of process or QA to say like, are we sure this is the right revenue number? What should it be? Does it include international? Does it exclude online? Does it include credits given or discounts? And all of those kind of different variations. So it's not a. I think a lot of folks have the process in place, but there's that little element of something just going wrong, just to validate things.
So is there something, as we kind of close, I want to close out this question, is there something people can think about in a short time, that because I could imagine people would they're skeptical of everything,
Mm.
and then it's paralysis, right? And they just they can't move forward. So are there any kind of just simple things to look out for, or be like, maybe that one versus I got to double check everything?
Yeah, I hate to say when it feels too good, right? It's kind of
Mm-hmm.
that's usually where there's something like it's just too right, right? Like I used in the earlier example, the customer was so over the top enthusiastic that just something didn't feel right.
Yeah. Or that just some number went up too much, maybe in your, and while you want it to be true, it might not be bad to just kind of go back and make sure that you're not going to be caught later finding out that, yeah, something did go wrong. And yeah, it's can be a challenge, but I like that idea of, because I think if you get too trusting, that could fall bad, like you're saying. But if you're not skeptical enough and you always believe it, you're also putting yourself at risk. And so there's just some kind of balance that people have to strike.
Yeah, and I think it's how you present it too, right? It wasn't like in this case where the gentleman was overly enthusiastic. It wasn't like, no, we shouldn't do it. Stop the presses. It was like, let's just check, right? It wasn't an enormous amount. Let's just spend 5 minutes just to go check and see what we see. We're not going to take a week to do anything. Let's just ask.
That's a good point too, right? It doesn't necessarily have to be a major undertaking. It's just more of a gut check kind of a thing where, yeah, we can go back and make just to satisfy your own curiosity on it. I think that's actually helpful to keep in mind. Cool. I like that one. All right. So, speaking about kind of like moving quickly, actually, it's kind of a perfect segue into this question. So, like, you've worked in software and product management for a long time, and I know a lot of people maybe listening to this aren't familiar with that world, like what it's like, and that world moves fast. You and I were even chatting about that a little bit before we started going live, and so I always think there's opportunities for people who are doing the kind of work in analytics to pick up their pace. It can be slow, and pick up the pace of their work. So what I want you to think about when I ask you this next question, think about something that people could use and that they could put into practice right away. So here's the question.
Okay.
So thinking about the things you do in software to help you move quickly about your making decisions in your product, can you think about something there that we could apply to how we deal with analytics to keep that moving faster?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I do think so obviously when you think about a product and the things that we work on, we think about features, right? It's interesting to see if most of your audience kind of is doing internal usage, or their audiences are internal, right? How much they think about it as a feature or as an app, right? That's something that's built to solve a problem. Not all problems are big. So if you use I like to kind of use as a frame of reference this idea about Kahneman's book about thinking fast and slow, right? The two kind of ways our brains kind of operate and solve problems. A lot of times in analytics, my observation is folks think about, they're very single threaded. They basically have this process where like everything's the same problem. What we do a really good job at SalesLoft is thinking about things that are kind of, here are quick wins and here are kind of the broader kind of challenges. And I think that there's always an opportunity to say like, what's a quick win, right? A quick win can often manifest as like, that label is really difficult. People don't understand the name of that metric, right? Can we just sit down and figure out something we can change that label? Can we change the tooltip? Can we do something textually that kind of makes the interpretation a little bit better? And that's something that's, if you're thinking about in our world, right? You have development, which you don't want to you want to avoid unnecessary developers' time, but having a technical writer or having some opportunity to kind of talk to writers, say like, hey, the way we're phrasing this, the way this labeled can be a quick win. So I think the first thing is think about like, do you have opportunities for quick wins versus kind of long-term, slow and fast. So we think about that way, like what are quick wins? So for us, a quick win is for instance, we did some filtering around relative dates recently, quarter to date, month to date, year to date kind of features. And obviously one thing that came back was, hey, it's the first week in September. What was August? Well, we didn't have the ability to show last month, the prior month.
Oh.
Right? But that was one of our quick wins. We noticed when folks were coming in, we looked at usage and we said, most people are coming in and what they're doing is the first week of the month, they're looking at a custom date. Why are they doing a custom date? Because they came in on the September 2nd, but they want to see August. So they don't have a drop-down option. But it was easy for us enough to say, all right, we already have relative dates. What can we do to say last month? And that was a quick win. And now we can know the following month to be like, how often are they seeing? Are they seeing last month? Are they using it? So a lot of times we think about things as these big, deep analytical problems, which there are, but there's also the opportunity to just get some quick wins.
So there's two things I took away from what you just said. One, I'm concerned for myself because you said we're supposed to be able to think fast and slow. I'm not sure about the fast part, but uh, I want to flip around what you said slightly, because not just quick wins, right? So quick wins make sense when you can do them. But the other thing you said, which I think is interesting, and I don't think happens almost at all. And this is also what I'm saying this from speaking with my customers, because it's actually something we work on. It's actually understanding how your product is being used, right? And I think about it as a product, right? Whatever your analytics is, it's some kind of product, whether it's, a recommendation, that's your product. If it's some kind of dashboard or story, that's your product. And understanding how it's actually used, not just in the sense of tracking like you did. You had some kind of tracking for your application, right? And a lot of people don't do that on, say, a dashboard. And the tracking is more like you said for the first example, somebody's counting how many views there were. That's useful, but not real. It's not necessarily an indicator of how it's of really how much it's being used and how it's being used, more importantly, right? And a lot of that's going to be just by going and talking to people to find out if they need that month going backwards, or if something's missing. And you can't always tell just by looking at the numbers that way. So I think it's a good thought. That's another big piece, of course, out of developing a real product, right? Is you usually actually go and have conversations with customers. It's not all about just looking at the data or things, tracking where they were on a website. You actually, or having a survey, right? You actually open your mouth, call them, talk to them, have some kind of interaction. So having said all that, is there anything else you could share with people about your experience in actually doing that? I know it sounds crazy, talking to customers that people who don't usually talk to their customers and are used to just fulfilling requirements. What is something they could do?
Yeah, so I think that I've always been very intentional about wanting to talk to customers, both the good and the bad, right? So I think that's part of building that muscle of just getting in front of customers and not being afraid of what they're going to say and just letting them talk, right? Mm-hmm. The other half of what I alluded to earlier is having that other side, which is, if you think about the actual interview as being the qualitative part or the survey part, is still having some ability to do quantitative and kind of striking a balance between those, right? So I'm sure there have been cases, I don't think of anything right now, where I've had a user say, this is the worst piece of software I've ever seen, and they logged in for 10 seconds, right? How do I discount their feedback in that way? So I can't remember a specific case, but I'm sure that's happened multiple times. I think striking that balance. To your point about, some cases we have vanity metrics like on websites, which is just like number of clicks, right? It does kind of give you a little bit of impetus to kind of ask the right question. Like, now I'm going to talk to Lee, who's my customer, and be like, hey, I saw you were in last week. You were clicking. What were you trying to do?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a bit of it's a lead generator, right? Because if you have a lot of customers, you're trying to find out, you might not be interested as much in the kind of average behavior, right? I mean, that might be good, but it's probably the outliers who have some real interesting things going on, right? Because it's like, well, if you're never using it or using it very nominally, it doesn't mean you don't get value out of it. It just might mean you don't need to use it a lot, and vice versa, right? You could be using it a lot and getting no value out of it. Maybe it's like you said, I have to keep going in and changing the month. That's why I spend 25 minutes in there fiddling around, but I only really needed to get to this one thing. If you could just fix that, I could be in and out in 20 seconds, right? So you can't just look at the numbers on the surface and completely know what's going on.
Yeah, and I think it ties back into the skepticism thing. You have to have a healthy skepticism or humility around your own knowledge or your own understanding. Like, do I understand this? Did I really get the full understanding of that conversation, or am I prepared to kind of be open-minded about the conversation that's upcoming?
Yeah, I think it's so easy. I mean, we just know in our general personal lives how easy it is to miscommunicate, right? That we shouldn't expect that for some reason in the business world, we never miscommunicate or we understand perfectly clearly, right? That's a bad thought. So yeah, this is good stuff. I'm liking this.
Yeah. If anything, if to your point about communication, if there's anything I try to coach a lot of my peers or those that are a little bit more junior than me, is around, don't assume because you told somebody once that they got it, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's and I think this comes from my experience about teaching. Is it's my responsibility to make sure that they get it and they understand it. Right. Not the fact that I delivered it, but that they got it, and I'm testing to validate that it was understood. So I think that's an important thing. It's like, yeah, but I told them last Wednesday. That doesn't.
Yeah, I mean, that's a whole interesting idea. I mean, we could talk about that kind of thing. Is a perception, and what I mean is it so? Right, that person said, "Well, I told them," which means, well, it's at this point, it's their responsibility. It's all on them. I did my part. Versus, wait, I didn't do a good enough job, maybe explaining it to them, right?
Yeah.
Or I did, but I just have to do it again, right? And it's kind of that shared. It's a shared responsibility.
And I think it translates really well to the internal versus external user, right? In an internal case, you and I both work for the same company. I send you my spreadsheet. You don't understand it. You can not use it, or I can say, like, the onus is really on you to understand it, Lee, because we're both in the same company, either to come back to me and ask questions, etc. But for an external user, my obligation is to make it understood for them, right? It's not on them to spend a lot of time understanding, to ask a lot of questions, to invest in an inordinate amount of time in it. It's just like any website. I need to kind of make it do as much on my end to make an understanding. And that's where if you have that distinction about an app or an external solution, you start to have that mindset, because in a lot of cases with the user, you get one shot to have your information understood. And that's it. That's all they're going to give you, because they don't understand it. They're moving on.
Yeah, it's true. There's as much as it might be important to them, they'll just find some other way to get around it. So I want to get to this, and I think this one actually kind of links into all the other things about having skepticism, having the ability to talk about these kinds of issues with each other. You started at SalesLoft just about a year ago, so I've got to imagine that there were some things that you saw you wanted to change when you got there. And I know from experience, when you're new to a company, that it can be uncomfortable because these are your ideas. You want to put these ideas in a place, but you've got to overcome that discomfort. So can you talk about maybe a few things that you wanted to change around analytics there, and some of the discomfort you faced and why? And kind of on top of that, do you think it was more personal or more about the company, or somewhere in between?
Yeah. I think the only thing that was a little bit that I think is common in any place that I've been over the past 10 years or so is there's always a bias two ways of, like, every customer we talk to says something different. We can't, and definitely some what I would call recency bias, right? This idea that, like, the last customer I talked to is the most important and the thing we're focusing on. So being able to kind of, like, take that in and then build that rapport with the team, right? Because especially from a development team and from a design team that we have a really strong one at SalesLoft, is creating kind of uncertainty with them or with any kind of team. That's where there's kind of friction. And to kind of remove a large degree of the uncertainty, like, hey, we talked to 10 customers. By the way, each said something different, but here are the things that they said the same. right? They
Right.
all, that gives a clear path forward for collectively as a team. The secondly is like in some cases, and not necessarily at SalesLoft, but in prior, let me stick to SalesLoft since that was your question. There's a little bit of recency bias, not as bad as others, but this idea that like, hey, the last customer we talked to, and for us to kind of just not react to that, but to wait. Let's see if a second customer says it. Let's see if that customer kind of escalates in some way. Let's see if it goes away. Right? Those are the two things. And the other thing I think that we've done a really good job at SalesLoft on our kind of immediate team of kind of 7 or 8 is to think about, I'm not the source of all ideas. Customers are not the source of all ideas. The team can be a source of ideas. Our sales team can be a source of ideas. Our product marketing team can be a source of ideas. But ideas are not kind of like only coming from me.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So there are a variety of opportunities for inputs, and not only just inputs just from hey, I have an idea for a new report, but we were thinking about, so often I'll be like, we're thinking about a report that works on some email templates. What do you think the challenges are with email templates? And get each of those various constituencies to kind of give their perspectives on that.
That's good, because you can't always see through their eyes like you think you can, right? And so having them really be part of that is smart. And I think there's not as much of that goes on probably with internal analytics. It's usually kind of small groups, or maybe it's coming from an executive or, kind of thing. So actually, I'm curious to probe a little bit. So you talked about this recency bias. I think somewhat of an equivalent of that, maybe in the corporate world, is I don't want to call it hierarchy bias, right? Mm-hmm. So it's, well, the person who's the most senior, or the person who maybe not even the most senior, the person who's just the loudest or the squeakiest, they're the ones who you tend to react to, right or wrong. So what are some things you do, maybe even a little bit more digging into that people could say they could apply some of those same principles that you use to kind of mediate that sense of, well, I got to respond to them. And whether it's waiting, which is sometimes hard, but
yeah, well, I'm probably one of the more senior people at SalesLoft just by age. So I probably leverage that to my advantage in some ways, because I'm like, I can kind of, I don't get rattled in terms of like someone more responsibility or somewhere in the hierarchy kind of asking something, that's just, being in my 50s, you just kind of, that's just what it is. So I think that case of one, not getting rattled. The second is being able to ask questions. Like, I know one of the challenges that I have with a prior boss at SalesLoft was this idea of context. Great, that's interesting. Tell me more. Where did that come from? Was that from a customer? Was that from the CEO? Where is that coming from? Is that urgent or important? Right? And just getting more context. And oftentimes we think we have to take something that our boss says and run with it. And we can't.
Sure.
And getting context is not pushing back. It's just getting more context.
Yeah. I think getting more comfortable with that is important for people. I think especially in this, I'll say future, because I don't see it really developing as much, but this whole notion of data democracy that people talk about, right? I like to think of it more as decision democracy, because not only can you let everybody have the data, that's one thing. It's like, now you're going to let everybody start making decisions. That's a whole nother boat, right? Because most people the decision making tends to be isolated, right? Or not as concentrated, right? These few people can make decisions. And that doesn't mean that everybody can make any decision, but you want to let, right? The idea is that data can enable that, I think. So that being able to have that kind of constructive conversation, right? All the way going back to the skepticism point you made right from the beginning, right? It's like, hey, what's the context behind that? Finding out a little bit more. How did we even get here? What was the point behind all this? And then, when you understand all that, then you can evaluate kind of the situation a lot better. But people have to I think there's a skill element that you have to give people. I don't think you can just say, ask questions to get context, because it's like, well, what if I'm not comfortable doing that for whatever reason? I'm an introvert, or I don't know what to say, or I don't have the experience level, and I'm just can't do it yet, right? And so you have to give people some support versus just saying, yeah, I'm okay if you do it. It's not so clear cut.
Yeah, I think that's really fair, Lee. I think early on is to be able to kind of take it and take that input in, and then go find someone that I can kind of talk it through, right? So someone that is a trusted source or a peer that I can kind of bounce it off and kind of, hey, can you? I don't need you to solve this for me. Can I talk it through with you?
That's great. Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, having that peer and just having a sounding board where you can just talk with someone and not feel like you have to figure it out all on your own, I think is a good practice. So actually, I think that's perfect. We're right at the 30-minute mark. So why don't we close out? So really appreciate, again, this was some really interesting conversation. I'm looking forward to seeing the Yankees win a game. They're on a little bit of a down streak right now. So maybe they'll start hitting those home runs, just like we want to hit some home runs with some of these ideas that you have. I think were really helpful. So thanks so much again for being with us.
No, I really enjoyed it, Lee, and happy to help any way I can. So look forward to our next conversation.
Absolutely. So long, everybody.
Thank you.